Welcome to My Jewish Learning. This morning slot is normally Daf Yomi Week in Review, and today we have an extra special program because it is Yom Haatzmaut. So happy Yom Haatzmaut, everybody. And today we are extending the class to an hour. So if you don't have a cup of tea or something next to you, go ahead and get one. We'll be here a little bit longer. And we're going to, instead of exploring this week in Talmud, we're going to explore the topic of Israel in the Talmud in honor of Yom Haatzmaut. And this morning's programming is part of a series of programs that My Jewish Learning has put together in honor of Yom Haatzmaut and in honor of our colleague Nate Geller, whom we lost this January and whom we missed very much and who loved Israel very much. And so at the end, I will be sharing some information about the other programs that are part of this series if you want to check them out. It turns out that the topic of, by the way, my name is Rachel Scheinerman, if I didn't say that. It turns out that the topic of Israel in the Talmud is really kind of a very interesting one and may have really interesting resonances for a lot of us today who maybe our primary language is English and maybe we don't live in the land of Israel. That's going to be our topic today. The Hebrew Bible, one way to read it is that basically it is a very long meditation or set of meditations on the covenant between God and Israel. And a huge piece of that covenant is the promise that you find very early on that God makes to Abraham, that the people of Israel will live in the land of Israel. And in some ways, you can read the whole Bible as being about this, how to get the people to the land, how they should live there, and then ultimately them being exiled from the land. You could read the entire Hebrew Bible as being mostly about the relationship of the people to the land. The relationship of the people to God is mediated by the land. And of course, the rabbis of the Talmud, they inherit all of this. But by the time they're reading it, now they have the perspective that the people has been exiled from the land twice. So that's one thing that is in their rear view mirror. And the other is that they are actually pretty comfortable where they are in Babylonia. So they're fully aware of the whole tradition and the attachment to the land, but also life is not terrible where they are. And so how should they and do they think about the land of Israel? That is what we have Rabbi Elliot Goldberg here today to talk to us about and to think through with us. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to him.
All right.
Rabbi Goldberg.
Thank you, Rachel, for that great introduction. Great to see so many familiar faces, new faces, and see that people are joining us from many, many places. I'm wondering, is anybody in Israel? If you're in Israel, put in the chat that you're in Israel. Let's see if we have any joining us from Yom Haatzmaut is in its waning hours in Israel. It looks like no one from Israel. Okay. I have two children in Israel right now.
We got one.
Oh, we got one. Yay. All right. Chag Sameach. Hope you had a good Yom Haatzmaut. I have two children in Israel right now who are seniors in high school, and they're on a semester-long trip with their class. It's a great way to have your senior slump, to apply to college, finish your classes, and spend 3 months learning about Israel. Bashetach, right, in the field, as they say, and they suggested that I bring a can of silly string or foam and like a big blow-up hammer, because I don't know if you've been in Israel on Yom Haatzmaut, but if you're out on the streets at night in the street party, you're likely to get sprayed with foam and bopped on the head by a blow-up hammer. Two important rituals that are post-Talmudic but very Israeli about Yom Haatzmaut. And if you're in Israel, maybe you had a nice barbecue this afternoon with family as you enjoyed the day. We share that in America as our Independence Day barbecues are part of the rituals as well. We pass on the silly string and the bopping. Anyways, um, when I think about Yom Haatzmaut, I think a lot about the question: what does it mean to me personally to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut as a committed diaspora Jew? And I say that, I'm a committed diaspora Jew. What I mean by that is I live here in America, in South Orange, New Jersey. I have no plans to move to Israel. I have a very nice connection with Israel. I was just there for Passover. I visit as often as I can, which isn't as often as I would like to. So I have warm feelings about it. So I have an attachment to the country, but I have a very nice and full and rewarding religious life here in North America. And so then the question becomes, how do I live with that? Because as Rachel hinted at, right, Israel is at the center for us, right? We are the people Israel, and our land is also called Israel. From the biblical perspective, as Rachel said, that's where we're supposed to be. Many rabbis of the Talmudic period and many biblical commentators and the rabbis who listed mitzvot include in their list of what the obligations are for the Jewish people. They include on that list to live in the land of Israel. And so for me, when it comes to Yom Haatzmaut and other Israel-related days, I think a lot about that question. What's my connection to Israel, and how do I square my Jewish life with the fact that there's this one aspect of Jewish living, Jewish identity about being in our land and being part of the Israel experiment that I'm not doing. And that's why the synergy of taking today's class and Yom Haatzmaut and highlights from the Talmud to think about that, I think, is well matched, because the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud, in some ways, are very much like us. They are living in Babylonia at a time that, relatively speaking, comparatively with their Jewish history, they have the good life. The Persian Empire that the Babylonians live under is tolerant of minority religions. The Babylonian community created the Talmud, and we know from the stories that are there, they have Batei Midrash, right? They have houses of study. They have a whole fully functioning Jewish community where they have time to sit back and think about all these things that we're reading in Daf Yomi, or that the Talmud includes. And then the question becomes, how do they deal with this question? How can we live in Babylonia when we're supposed to be living in Israel, and what do we do with that? We're going to take a look at some texts that reflect on that today. I wish I could say that the Mishnah had a Masechet Eretz Israel, right? A Masechet about the land of Israel, where it addressed these topics head on. Of course, it doesn't. There are agricultural laws and sections of the Mishnah and Talmud that talk about our obligations when we're farming the land of Israel. There are sections that talk about celebrating holidays in the land of Israel. But there aren't necessarily discrete places that say, here is where in the Talmud we're going to deal with exactly these questions about Israel. So we're going to slide into some selections from a few pages at the end of Masechet Ketubot, which in the Daf Yomi cycle we'll be at next. I think my Masechet Ketubot just shipped in the mail for my Daf Yomi study. And the rabbi's way into this is talking about some rules about marriage, and you'll see the connection in a moment when we turn to the text. But first, some questions to think about as we look at these texts. Well, one is what's the rabbi's agenda vis-a-vis Israel, and how do their values show through in the text that we're studying? And second, how do these texts potentially shed some light on our situation as North American Jews, and as we think about, or I guess we're worldwide. We have one in Israel. I didn't look to see if we have other countries as well. But as diaspora Jews who are thinking about our relationship with Israel, and can we draw from the wisdom of the rabbis and the Talmud to to help us think about this question about how do we think about our Jewish lives rooted in places other than Eretz Israel. Okay, too many words from me. Let's turn to some text. First, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start. Hang on, give me 1 second. I want to share my screen, but my slides seem to have gone away. Let me just find them again. Oh, here we go. Okay, coming back to Zoom. Pardon me. By now in the pandemic, I should be better at this, but here we go. All right, sharing my screen and starting the slideshow. So first, just want to, I have two maps to share just to give us some context. The map on the left is rooted in the biblical era. It more or less lays out where each of the tribes' lands were in the region of Eretz Israel, right? As we know from the Torah and mostly from the book of Joshua, right, from the biblical perspective, the land was settled by the Israelites as a people, but each tribe got its own land. And the biblical map shows where the tribe settled. And if you look, most of the tribes settle in land that is Israel today, and there are 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh that are settled on the east bank of the Jordan River, which is in Jordan today. But in the biblical vision, right, the Transjordan is part of the land of Israel. And right when the Bible says Israel, more or less, this is what it means. And the map on the right is very similar, but it lists, it shows the province of Judea, which was part of the Roman Empire, which was the ruling power at the time of the Mishnah, which is where we're going to start with some text today, and shows the different regions within that province. You'll see there's some overlap with the tribes and even some of the names, but also the reasons that are there. I also want to point out it lists major cities on the map from the 1st century, and that's because there are Jewish settlements in this period that are not in the lands that the tribes right, that the Bible envisions about where we're supposed to occupy. We know from archaeological evidence, for example, that there were Jewish settlements in the 1st century on the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is north of the area where the half of the tribe of Manasseh lives, and not in the biblical vision of Israel, but right, Jews had already spread out a little bit through the region. And you could see what's here. But if we think about Israel, both in the biblical and especially in the rabbinic period, when you think about three major regions, one is Judea, which is similar to where the tribe of Judah was in the south, the Galilee in the north, and then the settlements that were east of the Jordan River in the Transjordan. And while the rabbis lived in Roman Palestine, Roman Judea, they thought about themselves as having 3 regions, right? The Galilee, Judea, and east of the Jordan River as sort of the settlement of the land of Israel and where they were. All right. So from that, we're going to go to some text. We're going to start by talking about some laws related to marriage. And here's the question for people to think about. It's been true in my life. I don't know if it's true in yours. At some point in time, my wife and I had conversations about where do we want to live? Where do we want to build our Jewish home? Do we want to do that in America, the place where we grew up and raised, where our grandparents came to originally several generations ago? Or do we want to live in Eretz Israel? It happened that we agreed about where we would live, but the Mishnah that we're going to look at talks about what happens if 2 members of a couple, a husband and wife, have different opinions about where they should live. And from that, we'll be able to tease out some values about what the rabbis have to say about Eretz Israel. Okay. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a Braita. This is a Mishnah era text, not in the Mishnah, but quoted in the Talmud. If the husband says that he wishes to make aliyah and the wife says she does not wish to make aliyah, one forces her to make aliyah. So fact one that the rabbis say, if a husband wants to make aliyah and his wife does not, he can force her to make aliyah. And if she won't, if she absolutely refuses, she's divorced without receiving her marriage contract. So what does that mean, right? If the husband decides to make aliyah, the wife is supposed to follow, and we force her to go, but that doesn't mean we put her in chains and send her after no matter what. If she refuses to go, she's allowed to do that, but that allows the husband to divorce her and not pay her out the guarantees in their ketubah, in their marriage contract, that she's supposed to get upon divorce or his death. We'll learn more about the ketubah in the next Masechet in Daf Yomi, but it's the terms of the marriage contract that the rabbi set up provide for the financial security of the woman after divorce or the death of her husband. And if she does not make aliyah with her husband, she loses that. So there's financial incentive. That's part of the way that we force her to go. Now, if she wishes to make aliyah and he says that he does not wish to make aliyah, one forces him to make aliyah. If you've been following along in Masechet Yevamot, and we'll see more later in the whole Seder Nashim, this is one of the rare times where the rabbis give the woman in a marriage equal power to the man about a particular decision or particular issue. Just as the husband could force his wife to make aliyah, so too can the wife force the husband to make aliyah. But if he refuses to go, he must divorce her and give her the marriage contract. And this is radical for the rabbis because divorce is, in the rabbinic system, is an action that's initiated by the man. And the woman usually doesn't have the power to demand or compel a divorce. Right? We have situations today where women are called agunot. They're in marriages that ultimately that really have ended, but because the husband won't do the things that he needs to do to make the divorce happen, the woman might be functionally divorced, but she's not actually divorced. And here, around the issue of moving to Eretz Israel, not only do we say if the wife wants to make aliyah, the husband has to follow. There's the courts, the rabbis can step in, and if he refuses to go, this is the one case where a woman can demand a divorce and receive the full economic benefits of the marriage contract that she had going into the marriage. So we're going to peek at, two more scenarios, and then we'll open it up to some thoughts and questions.
Rabbi Goldberg, before we continue,
Yes.
First off, some people would like to know if they could have access to this document, if you're able to share it with us. That would be, after the meeting would be fine.
Sure.
Screen. Yeah. If you, I think people like to return to it sometimes.
Oh, sure.
So afterward would be fine. I think.
After.
And the other is you have a question in the chat that I think might be worth addressing, which is at least one person here is surprised that the rabbis are using the word aliyah, which sounds very modern.
Okay. I like both questions. I will definitely share the slides, which will give you also the source, where these sources are from, so you can find them here in the slides or the fuller text online as well. Sorry. I tried to highlight something in my slides, but that just moves the slides to the next page. If you see in the in the second line of text, right, if the husband says that he wishes to make aliyah, right, the Hebrew says, hu omer la'alot, he says to make aliyah, right, to go up. So aliyah is one of those Hebrew words that's entered Jewish English, right? So aliyah, we think, in terms of like Jewish English, aliyah is a word we use all the time to mean to go move to live in Israel. This is not a new concept or a new way of thinking about it. The rabbis in the Mishnah, the rabbis in the Talmud, when they talk about traveling to Israel, you don't go to Israel, you go up to Israel. And that has to do with, right, we'll see some texts about this later, but it has to do with the concept that Israel is a higher level of holiness than the rest of the world, and we go up to Israel. And then the same is true within Israel. We go up, we make Aliyah when we go to Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem is seen as having a higher sanctity. And then within Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, we go up to the Temple Mount. Now with Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, if you've been in Israel, there's actually a going up, right? Because you go up into Israel, to Jerusalem, it's in the hills, and the Temple Mount is, you go up to it because it's up. Although where we enter the old city these days, first we generally go down a bunch of stairs into a valley and then go back up to the Temple Mount if we were to visit it. But indeed, this is not a new way of thinking about it. And that hints at, because the preferential treatment that Israel gets as a land from the rabbis, right, it has its own verb about what it means to go there, which puts it on a higher plane. Okay. So let me just, we'll think about that some more in terms of that. I just want to finish this one text, which is the second piece. So the converse of what we just saw is true. If she says, if a woman says she wishes to leave Eretz Israel, so a couple lives in Israel, and here the Hebrew term says latzet, right, to go out. In modern Hebrew, we use the opposite of aliyah, yeridah, right, to go down from Israel. So there's a place where linguistically it's not the same. But if she says she wishes to leave Eretz Israel and he does not wish to leave, one forces her not to leave, and if she won't, she's divorced without receiving her marriage contract. So if a couple lives in Israel and the woman wants to leave, she doesn't like living there anymore, she wants to go someplace else, she's compelled to stay, but if she demands to go, right, we ultimately let her do that, but she doesn't receive the economic support that she would receive if she were divorced by her husband for other reasons. And if he wishes to leave Eretz Israel and she does not wish to, right, one forces him not to leave, we try to compel him to stay. But if he won't stay, he must divorce her and pay out her marriage contract. So this half of this Braita is the parallel to the first half that we saw. And has the same economic incentives and the same pieces built in to try to keep the couple in Eretz Israel, even if one of the partners wants to leave. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and think about this. So here's a text. It's really framed to be about marriage and rules of divorce, but embedded in that is a conversation about aliyah. And so wondering in terms of what you see in the text, in terms of the values that the rabbis are putting forward, and what that says about where this text, or the rabbis as a whole in the Mishnaic period, if this is representative of it, think that we ought to live, and how that squares with other values they might have. Any thoughts, reactions, or comments related to the text we just saw? You can use the reactions button and raise your hand, and we can let you jump in.
Have you ever seen a scenario like this where a couple split up over the issue of aliyah?
I'm waiting in the silence to give people a chance to process and respond. I think about, as I read this text, I think about, when I was growing up in Jewish youth groups and camps, we did a lot of values clarification exercises. You would get like little slips of paper that said, studying Torah, keeping kosher, celebrating the holidays, joining the JCC, living in Israel, and you write all these different values. And you have to sort of rank them in order and say what's most important to you and what's most important to Jewish identity. In some ways, these texts are Jewish values clarification from the Mishnaic period, where it seems to me that the rabbis are saying living in Israel is more important than sustaining your marriage. And Michael Stock just chimed in and said, right, aliyah is obviously an ultimate value. Right here we see aliyah as a value above preserving a marriage, right? That if a couple is not of one mind about where they should live, and Israel is one of those options, right? The counseling that we might provide them, or the nudging we might provide them, is to say, well, if someone wants to go to Israel, the other partner should stay in the marriage and go. And if they can't come to terms on that, we're going to, end the marriage as a result of that. In fact, the economic and other incentives are built in more than they would be to preserve, the person who wants to go to Israel. Israeli glue stronger than marriage glue. I like thinking about that way, right? The being attached to Israel, the strength of the bond, stronger, says this text, is the strength of the bond to Israel than to marriage. Now the questions are coming. If a man refuses a get, should the wife declare that she's moving Israel? That forces a get, and once she has the get, here's a strategy, right? If there's a marriage where someone's
we have a lawyer.
stuck, right, based on this text, I guess that is true. If a woman wants out of her marriage and can't do that, and the husband will not let her, based on this text and the halakha, she could say she's moving to Israel, and that would compel, right, in places where a religious court has sway, the court could void a marriage based on her desire to make aliyah. Interesting. Giving a marriage contract after divorce, does that mean giving a get? That's a great clarification question. So giving a get is the divorce document that one gives that ends the marriage. But with the giving of a get, there are terms of the ketubah that are actually still written in many contemporary ketubot today, where upon divorce, the ketubah laid out the terms of certain property and certain payments that a woman would get at the time of divorce. So delivering a get delivering the divorce document is what officially ends the marriage, but that also triggers certain clauses of the ketubah where the woman would get certain payments from the husband's estate and certain property that she brought into the marriage, the ability to take out. So it's two steps of the process. And if you're a Daf Yomi reader, Masechet Gittin's coming in the next year or so. We'll look at that as well. Anita says, true, moving to a different country wasn't as easy as it is today. That is true. The whole notion of travel, right? We could get on a plane right now and be in Israel, depending on where you're starting, right, in 10 to 15 hours. It was a much harder journey then. The notion that you would pick up and move from somewhere to Israel isn't the same as it is today in terms of the physical task, but also the, relocating to a new country, to a new culture is a challenge one way or another. And there might be some of the Gemara in this section that we're not going to look at today talks about desire to move and what that means in terms of like standard of living and changing standard of living, and knowing that if you're comfortable where you are, moving is hard, and there are ways you have to take that into account. So thanks for that comment. All right, so we see from
on the other hand, you don't have like as many belongings, you don't have a passport. There might be aspects of moving that are actually easier. I don't know.
That's true, especially these days, right? You don't need they didn't need a COVID test to go to Israel.
Do you mind, Rabbi Goldberg, if I respond to one of these others here that I thought was really interesting? This idea that aliyah, that in some way, I thought it was an interesting metaphor. A person's relationship to Israel can be so strong that it overrides their relationship to their spouse in some way, almost like if those two relationships are in competition. But also on the flip side of it, what struck me about this text is, yes, the desire to live in Israel can be seen as, I guess, maybe holy enough that the sanctity outweighs the sanctity of the marriage, but there's not going with that the sense that and everybody should move to Israel, right? You might think that if moving to Israel is of such prime value, that if you are moved to do it, then you can end your marriage. And even a woman who usually cannot independently end her marriage, even she can, right? That's how powerful it is. And yet they're not saying it's only if you want to, right? And there's not a whole lot in rabbinic literature that's, well, only it's this significant, but it's only if you want to. I thought that was, one of the reader's comments made me think that.
Yes, that's definitely true, right? And actually, well, some, as I said in my introduction, some rabbis who count the mitzvot in the Torah count living in Israel as one of those mitzvot, and some don't. So, right, there's a question in our tradition: is it an obligation to live there or not? And Rachel, what you're pointing to is the Mishnah is privileging living in Israel, but it's not demanding it. And that's an important slice of that, and we know that right in ancient times, right, there were times when there were thriving Jewish communities in cities in Egypt, very close, but close to Israel, but not in Israel. We know stories of a number of the famous biblical commentators picked up, and moved from where they lived, in the Islamic Empire and moved to Israel. But many didn't, and people stayed. And right, especially, later as you get to the Middle Ages and Jews spread out through Europe and North Africa, cities are, Jewish life is established in all kinds of places. And this question of should I be living in Israel starts to rise in new ways. We see a practical question: would Israel have enough room for all Jews? If you ask Israelis, they would say, "Sure, come in, we'll make space." There is a if what I noted just being in Israel for Passover, there is a practical issue. There's construction going on all over the country as the population is growing and more people need places to live. And there's a practical question, right? Should everyone live in Israel? Can all Jews live in Israel? What is that even possible in our day? In the time of the Mishnah, there definitely was room for everyone to live in Israel. 90% of Israeli population lives in urban settings, so there's room, says Rob. That is true, although the environmentalist lobby in Israel is worried about the loss of the empty spaces in the natural environment. But that's also a question, right? Is there other, right? A practical question: is there room to live in Israel? That's a different way of thinking about it. Not what the Mishnah raises, but another dilemma about this. All right, we're going to I'm going to go back and share my screen. Turn to a new text. This comes from the discussion that follows in the Talmud, and now deals with teacher and student, not husband and wife, but tells this story here. Rabbi Zera was avoiding his teacher, not something that we see students do in the Talmud a lot. Actually, we have more stories about students who are following their teachers, all kinds of places to see how they live their life, not just in the Beit Midrash, but in the privacy of their home as well. But Rabbi Zera was avoiding his teacher, Rabbi Yehuda, as Rabbi Zera, sought to ascend to Israel. He wanted to make Aliyah. Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yehuda are rabbis of the Talmud. They live in Babylonia. Although a hint in this, Rabbi Zera, who's called Rabbi and not Rav, that means he became a rabbi in Eretz Israel. So it adds a little twist to the story. But because Rabbi Zera was by his title, it meant his smicha, his rabbinic ordination was in Israel, but he ends up living in the Babylonian community. We know there's movement back and forth between the two. But Rabbi Yehuda is going to leave Babylonia to ascend to Israel. Rabbi Zera is going to leave and move to Israel, but Rabbi Zera is avoiding him because Rabbi Yehuda says, anyone who ascends from Babylonia to Israel transgresses a positive commandment. As it's stated, they shall be taken to Babylonia, and there they shall remain until the day that I recall them, says the Lord. A quote from Jeremiah. So interesting to note, Rabbi Yehuda's teaching says it's a positive commandment, but the verse he quotes is from the prophets and not from the Torah. We often think of, right, the mitzvot that we're supposed to do coming from the Torah. There are things in the rest of the books of the Bible that influence practice. But here Rabbi Yehuda is saying, right, it's a mitzvah taseh, a positive commandment, something that you should do. Based on this verse in Jeremiah, you're supposed to stay in Babylonia where we were taken, meaning from Rabbi Yehuda's perspective, God was involved in the exile of our people from Eretz Israel to Babylonia, and based on Jeremiah's prophecy, we're supposed to stay in Babylonia until God recalls us, till God brings us back. This is an argument that has roots in the Talmud and actually had roots in the early discussions of Zionism. Religious Zionists at the end of the 1800s, as the Zionist debate was emerging, made this claim as well that yes, one day we will live in Israel, but that will happen when God redeems us from our exile. And that has to do with some things that Rachel might have hinted at, right? Our covenant to have the land of Israel depended on us being true to the covenant. And the rabbinic theology says, sees the exile from Israel as punishment for not living up to the standards that God has for us, and that we should dwell in exile until it's time to return. And Rav Yehuda takes that literally, because he teaches that if you're living in Babylonia, you have to stay there until not that you want to go to Israel, but until God makes it so that there's a return from exile, and you can go. So how, the Gemara asked, or the question is implied, could Rav Yehuda, how could Rabbi Zera, who wants to go back to Israel, do this if this verse is there? Well, he interprets the verse differently. He says the verse is written about the temple service vessels, right? The holy objects, that it was not just the people that were exiled, it was the ritual objects that we used in the temple that were also exiled. And Rabbi Zera says, well, Jeremiah was not talking about the people. Jeremiah was talking about the sacred vessels that also were exiled in the exile, and they and maybe temple service can't restart until God brings us back to the land of Israel. But we as individuals have the right to go back and live in Israel. So an interesting dynamic between these two teachers. Rabbi Zera, who started in Israel, went to Babylonia, settled, found a teacher, became part of the community there, wants to go back. And Rabbi Yehuda teaches, no, you can't go back. It's a commandment for us to stay here. It's God that determines when we go back, not us. So we saw the Mishnah that talked about what happens if a husband and wife have a different opinion about where they're supposed to live, and Israel is one of those countries. Here, the way Rav Yehuda frames it, we have a debate where there's a person wants to go to Israel. The question is, can the person go if it's not clear that that's God's vision for the Jewish people? Should we stay in exile until the time when we're supposed to go back? And for centuries, this approach was central to Jewish thinking and Jewish theology. Jews who stayed in the diaspora, and some of that decision to stay in the diaspora en masse had to do with this assumption that we belong here until we earn the right to go back. And just as God brought us there from Egypt, just as God returned us there after the first exile from the Babylonians, the second exile that was from the Romans will last until God brings us back. And if God does not act, we should not act. And in the early Zionist discussions, this was a major voice. And actually, Herzl and the other Zionists who said, no, we can bring the redemption ourselves and make Israel a thing. That was a radical Jewish stance for the early Zionists who advocated going to Israel to take. And they said, we can take this into our own hands. Some even saying, going and settling the land will force God's hand to bring the redemption. If we can make the redemption happen by starting it on our own. And it's the pioneers who not just went to farm the land and clear the swamps and build a society in the land of Israel, who made the state of Israel happen, but it's also the brave souls who bucked the tradition, right? Turned over 1,000 years of thinking about, more than 1,000 years, 1,500 years at least of thinking about that we're supposed to be in the diaspora, that made that happen. Excuse me. But so much so that here we see not a tension between a husband and wife, we see a tension between a student and his teacher. Because one student is rooted in the diaspora, the other student wants to go back, and it causes the student to avoid his teacher because he doesn't want to have to confront his teacher and go against his teaching by going back to Israel when his teacher wants to stay. That's one way to look at it. There's another vision. There's another vision of the relationship between living in Babylonia and living in Israel that follows in the conversation in the Gemara. Rav Yehuda, same character from before, says that Shmuel said, just as it's prohibited to leave Israel and go to Babylonia, so too is it prohibited to leave Babylonia and go to other lands. And Rav Yehuda also says, anyone who resides in Babylonia is as though he is residing in Israel. As it's stated, Hoid Sion, escape you who dwell with the daughter of Babylon. He's got a verse to prove that too from Zechariah. Two interesting moves that this text makes that shifts a little bit and brings in a different voice from what we saw in the Mishnah that prioritizes living in the land of Israel. And this says, in some ways, Babylonia becomes the stand-in for Israel. Right? You can't leave Israel to go to Babylonia because Israel has a higher level of sanctity. But if you're in Babylonia, you can't leave Babylonia to go to any other lands. As if Babylonia is like the second, right? If Israel is at the top of the priority list, right? Bavel is second, and leaving Babylonia is equated to leaving Israel, and they lay that over. And Rabbi Yehuda takes that even further to say living in Babylonia is just as if you were living in Israel. Ki'ilu dar be'eretz Israel. Living in Babylonia is almost or maybe even just as good as living in Israel. A different view from the Babylonian sages from what we saw in the Mishnah where Israel took priority. Here we see the rabbis in Babylonia saying, this is the place where we're supposed to be, and we're not supposed to leave. Now, you might see that in the frame of what we had before, that we're waiting for God to bring us back, or you might see that this as rabbinic voices saying, we've established a new Zion here in Babylonia, and you should stay here because this is the place where we're supposed to be. I think about two things when I think about those texts. One's from a different faith tradition. I think about I don't know if you know this, right? As the Mormons, the Mormon population started to grow and face persecution in America and moved first from New York west to the Midwest and ultimately settled in Utah. They discovered in Utah a salty lake with a river flowing into it and reminded them of Eretz Israel. And the Salt Lake, which we call the Great Salt Lake at Salt Lake City, they saw that as parallel to the Dead Sea and actually named the river. The river that flows into the Salt Lake in Utah is called the Jordan River. And it's no accident that one of the national parks in the region is Zion National Park, because the Mormons looking for a home used the biblical metaphors and actually said, this is our new Zion in Utah. Right? They were overlaying biblical imagery to find a home that would be an escape for them from persecution, and they found their promised land. That's a contemporary example from a different religion. But in some ways, these last texts from the Talmud in Babylonia are saying that Babylonia is the new Zion, and maybe we ought to live there. And I wonder sometimes if, as Jews settle themselves and establish themselves in other cities and other places around the world, do we think about that as the new Zion? Right? Sometimes historians of the Jewish experience look at the Jewish experience in North America and say, the Jewish community has never in the history of its existence had it so good as we have it in North America and the North American countries and the way in which they've embraced us, and we've rooted ourselves here and we've built Jewish culture and institutions that America's the new Zion. And they have a diaspora view that says Israel might be a place you can go if you want to go, but maybe it's not the privileged space that first Mishnah gives it that says, that's where we're supposed to be. And the rabbis struggle with this in the Babylonian Talmud, and we, in those last slides, see some strong voices in the Talmud in Babylonia saying, no, here is the place where we should be. You shouldn't leave Babylonia. One voice acknowledged that Israel might be a higher priority, a higher value, and the other voice said, no, Babylonia is the place we're supposed to be. And it's an interesting thing to think about, especially, I know, as I see these texts, I struggle, and they rub me a little bit the wrong way in a certain sense that says, well, it's a little bold saying Babylonia has replaced Israel. You could say it's a little bold to say, right, New York City has replaced Israel as a Jewish center, even though New York City is, in terms of population and institutional life, a Jewish center that rivals Israel. And as someone who's committed to living in the diaspora, as I see those statements, in some ways it should be validating. But for me, it calls into question that, well, maybe there's a whole piece of my tradition that I'm ignoring, by ignoring the fact that, maybe I should be living in Israel, and it's not this voice from the Talmud that confirms the comfort of, or confirms the place of the diaspora Jewish living. Might not be, when I see it in print, I say, well, that doesn't sound right, and maybe I have to question the choices that I made. And I would say that's something I think a lot about on Yom Haatzmaut, today in particular, where we're celebrating, right, the independence of Israel, which as a non-Israeli citizen, definitely, in terms of the Jewish experience and the importance of the state of Israel, is a day that I note on the calendar and celebrate and bring into my life, ritually and spiritually. And it makes me think, well, why do I stop short then of moving there? Why is visiting enough for me as opposed to living there? And I leave that as an open question. It's an open question for me in my life, although I'm not moving, but I'm not sure that it always sits well with me. And sometimes I think about, like, just as the rabbi said, Israel is of greater value than marriage in that Breita that we saw. It makes me think about, are there greater values than Israel that I hold? And where does Israel fit in terms of my Jewish values? And how do I account for that and account for Israel in my life as a committed, as a Jew who's committed to living in the diaspora where my family is and where we've raised our kids? What does that mean for us? Ooh, and Saul said it well, right? What does that mean then, right? When we end our Seder by singing Next Year in Jerusalem. I can tell you, for me, sometimes that's the prayer that next year I'll be in Jerusalem for Passover, because it's not a bad place to vacation. But really, what that phrase has meant in the Haggadah, right, Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, is not about tourism. It's really about living there. All right, let me pause. Rachel, I don't know if you've been following the chat. It moved a little too quickly for me. If there are things you saw to call out for us to respond to, or some voices we want to let into the conversation, I'd love to give you that opening to select some if you saw.
Yeah, please, folks, feel free. We have a little bit of time left if folks want to ask more questions. We have someone ask rather directly if Rav Yehuda is just it doesn't really have a theological defense of his position, except that, you know what, Rabbi Yehuda, of course, the one who said that living in Babylonia is as sacred as living in Israel and just as much of a value. Is that just a cop-out? I think is basically the question. Is that just a cop-out?
It could be. What's great about the Talmud is, like, it's open to read in lots of different ways. And what I would say is also, given that we were together for a short time, I selected from the text on Ketubot 110 and 111 to spur our conversation. If you are interested to read the more selections from those pages, there are more voices. But I think in the Gemara, in this section, it starts with statements, earlier statements about how Israel is a priority, we start to see the rabbis in Babylonia both make statements of discomfort, how they're not living in Israel, and they feel uncomfortable with that, and others who embrace it and say, no, we live in Babylonia, and this is where we're supposed to be. It might be that some of the biblical interpretation that says, right, Jeremiah or Zechariah, the prophets are saying, this is what it's supposed to be and part of God's plan. You might not buy that that's actually what the prophets had in mind. But I do think it's reflective of Jews living comfortably in a land that under an empire that allows them to live in a way that in their recent memory they haven't had, and that life under the Persians in Babylonia was far more comfortable than life under the Romans in Eretz Israel, and that staying in the Fertile Crescent, where they built a whole institutional life and cultural life, and they're really rooted, is a place to be.
And less persecuted.
Yeah, and less persecuted. And in Jewish history, the shift of power, right, Jewish rabbinic power left Eretz Israel and went to Babylonia after the Talmud, the Geonim, who became the next generations of rabbis who were the center of the Jewish world, were in Babylonia. There really is that shift. Zionism didn't arise, in Babylonia in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, but Jewish life thrived there, and Jews from North Africa and Europe looked to Babylonia as their home and center. It's part of why the Babylonian Talmud is the Talmud that takes root in Jewish legal discussions and what we study, as opposed to the Yerushalmi, which was written in the land of Israel, because the center of Jewish life was Babylonia. And that voice of, here's our center, this is where our community is, and this is where we are, stuck. Is that a cop-out? Maybe. But just like the rabbis dealt with the destruction of the temple and the shift of the center of Jerusalem from, the center of Judaism out from Jerusalem to other cities in Israel, you could say it was a natural progression that shift just went farther from the center and landed in Babylonia. Jennifer, I like this question. I haven't mentioned rebuilding the temple. Did the Amoraim move away from this idea, and if so, when? That's great, because we know the temple's the center. A lot of ink is spilled in the Mishnah and the Talmud about the temple. Right. If you've been with us for Daf Yomi, you know much more of Masachet Pesachim, right? The Masachet that talks about Passover talks about what happened in the temple on Passover than about what we do at the Seder. Or the same is true about Yoma, about Yom Kippur. Much more of the Talmuds about what happened in the temple on Yom Kippur than what happens on Yom Kippur after there is no more temple. Right, some argue that this is the rabbis trying to preserve the tradition so that when it is time to go back, right, the rules will still be with us. Some argue this is like rabbinic nostalgia to an age past, but not really a vision of a restorative future. It's hard to know for sure, right? Pragmatically, what the rabbis in Babylonia knew, the notion of picking up, moving to Israel, establishing a community there and having both the political permission and the financial resources to rebuild the temple wasn't in the cards. So it might be pragmatic that they weren't thinking about that. But the temple does play as an image, right, as a holy place. And we do a lot of thinking about what happened in the temple. Now, is that just to preserve the knowledge? Is that because they really saw a vision of a third temple period? Hard to know. Right, there's an institute in the Old City in Jerusalem right now that is actually building the kelim, right? They're making the vessels that we use they're using biblical and rabbinic records to actually make the things that we would need. Because there's this group of Jews who wants us to be ready so that if tomorrow somehow we had the temple back, we could start temple worship immediately, because we have all the stuff we need there. We just don't have the temple. So that ideology exists today. You can actually visit. They would and take a tour. They'll show you. They'll take a tour. they'll take you on a tour and show you what you need to have. It's fascinating to see that theology today. I don't feel that strong in the Talmud. It does fade after the temple period. Much more of the halachic literature at post-Talmud deals with the parts of Judaism that we live today and not the sections of the Talmud that talk about the temple. And the shift happened slowly over time. And the fervor to return to Israel was more about, that happened over time, was more about the Jewish desire to have a nation state, to be our own, for safety and security, right? Post-Holocaust especially, right? Some people frame Israel as, right, Israel is a refugee state, right? The state of Israel was created by and sustained by refugees who lost where they had to live, and needed a place where they could be them, and they carved out that space in Israel to make a place and a home for Jews. In its existence, Israel served that way for Jewish populations under duress, and individual Jews who want to move there, and not for the restoration of the temple. When exactly did that happen? It's hard to know, but I think slowly over time, that focus of Judaism shifted, and we've moved far away from temple worship, and I don't think for most of us that the notion of animal sacrifice as a means to connect to God is a next step, even if by some strange twist in fate, the Temple Mount would be free. I don't think the Muslims who currently have houses of worship on the Temple Mount are putting those buildings up for sale anytime soon. But even if they were, I don't think, while there will be voices to return, I don't think that'll be the dominant view.
We're gonna go ahead and leave it there. Rabbi Goldberg, thank you for bringing such an interesting and complicated set of texts for us to think through these issues, and showing us once again that the tradition is almost never a monolith, even on something that seems so central. There's a lot of different voices and opinions about it. I wanted to let everyone know, in case you missed the conversation at the very beginning, that today's class on Israel in the Talmud is part of a series of classes for Yom Haatzmaut that My Jewish Learning has put together in honor of our beloved colleague Nate Geller, whom we lost in January. Nate loved Talmud. He loved Israel. He would have loved this class. He would have loved to be here. And we're grateful that you did it for us. I popped in the chat some of the other classes. If you want to, there's a link with information about the other classes if you want to see what else is happening. We already had our Israeli dance class a few days ago. That now the recording is up on YouTube, I believe, if you want, our YouTube channel, which is also My Jewish Learning, if you want to check it out. And there's more coming, including at 2:00 today. The JTA is having conversation about what's next in Israel-U.S. relations. And there is also a history of Israeli food coming in a couple of days. So please feel free to check those offerings out as well. It was really lovely to see you all. And next week, we will return to our regularly scheduled Daf Yomi week in review.
For those who asked for the link to the slides, I just put it also in the chat. If you want the link that Rachel posted, you have to go 2 back. I don't mean to usurp the last link position in the chat, but people asked for that. I wanted to share.
Okay, sorry. I forgot about that. Yes, so the link to the slides is there. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. It was good to see you, and we will see you again soon.